I've repeated that line in my head 100 times tonight, and each time it tastes a little bitter, a little wrong. I'm sitting in the corner of the repair shop where I work, fingers sticky with engine grease, and somehow the memory of her smile keeps slipping between the noise of clanking tools and the hum of fluorescent lights. She came in like she always does, that calm certainty that makes you feel like the world's edges have softened for a moment. The older woman, Sophie, though I don't say it out loud here, because in this space I'm just counting heartbeats, walked in with a book tucked under her arm and a gentle, knowing smile that made me forget the whole morning's chaos. She wasn't just confident, she was deliberate in the way she moved, like every gesture had its own rhythm, and somehow she made the entire dusty, oil-scented shop feel quieter. I watched her balance a coffee cup in one hand, her coat draped over the other arm, and she glanced at me as if she knew I was staring. I looked away too fast, a nervous flush creeping up my neck. That glance, brief, weighted, meaningless on the surface, set something loose in me I didn't understand yet. A spark, maybe, or just the awareness that this woman, who had been visiting my shop for months, was quietly, irresistibly present. We didn't speak for a while. She wandered to a shelf with old manuals and magazines, flipping through one with an almost imperceptible tilt of her head, the corner of her mouth tugging upward. I tried to focus on the car I was working on, the stubborn engine bolt that refused to budge, but I kept catching her in my peripheral vision. She hummed a line from some song I didn't know, just a few notes, soft enough that I wasn't sure if she realized she was making sound. Then she did something small that made my chest tighten. She reached over, brushing a smudge of grease off my forearm. Just like that. No words, no explanation. Just her fingers lingering a fraction too long, a warmth against my skin that made the air around us shift. I froze, wrenched halfway in the socket, because for a split second, I was entirely aware of her, entirely aware of myself, and entirely unprepared for how sharply that awareness hurt. She laughed, quiet, almost self-conscious, like she was aware she'd broken some invisible rule. And I wanted to say something clever, something that would make me seem less like I'd been caught in my own head. But I didn't. I just let the moment stretch, let it hover between us like the faint smell of oil and coffee. She left soon after, coat swinging lightly, book clutched against her chest, and the sound of the door closing felt louder than it should. I leaned against the workbench, staring at the empty space where she'd been, and I realized I hadn't even asked her about the book, or told her she'd forgotten her pen at the counter. Little things. Things I should have said, but didn't. Things that now haunted me. And I can't stop thinking about it. That fleeting, careless touch. That smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but somehow reached me anyway. I don't know what it means yet. I don't know if it's dangerous, or foolish, or inevitable. But I know that when I close my eyes tonight, it's her face that comes first. The rest of the world, grease, tools, the hum of the fluorescent lights, falls away, leaving just that spark, that unspoken thing, lingering in the air between us. I didn't expect her to come back so soon. The bell above the repair shop door jingled, and I glanced up, wiping my hands on a rag. Sophie stood there, her coat slightly wrinkled from the rain, hair damp at the ends, a faint crease between her brows that made her look almost fragile, almost human. She held a stack of books this time, a mixture of manuals and novels, and set them down on the counter like she wasn't sure she wanted them at all, or like she didn't want to be here at all. I didn't say anything, just stepped over to help her carry the heavier ones toward the corner table. Her hands brushed mine once. Accidental, she would have claimed, but I noticed the small tremor in her fingers. She avoided my eyes, and I found myself wishing she wouldn't. There's a strange tension in noticing someone so carefully, the way your mind catalogs every twitch, every breath, every small human imperfection. "Thanks," she said finally, voice clipped, polite, but softer than usual. A crack in her usual armor. I nodded, trying not to stare at the way her sleeves slid down over her wrists, how her hands flexed nervously around the books. She was meticulous, precise, but just now, in this tiny pause, she seemed unmoored, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten. We arranged the books together, side by side. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, something floral, understated, and it mixed strangely with the sharp tang of oil and metal. She laughed at something I said, lightly, almost shyly, and it was the kind of laugh that makes you listen, as if your ears are the only ones allowed. But then her smile faltered, and she looked away, eyes tracing the lines of the cracked floor tiles, as if she were trying to disappear into the texture of the shop. "You look tired," I said, before I could stop myself. Her head jerked up, startled, as though she hadn't realized anyone noticed. She blinked, pressed her lips together, and for a moment I thought she might scowl, or dismiss me, or retreat behind some polite wall. But she didn't. Instead, she let out a soft sigh, leaning slightly on the counter, a shadow of exhaustion in her posture that made her seem smaller than usual. "Just long week," she murmured. Her voice was low, quiet, almost confessional. I wanted to ask more, to pull her out of that moment, but I held back. There's a fine line between noticing someone and intruding on the fragile parts they don't offer easily. I watched her adjust the books again, her hands lingering on the edges, fingertips brushing lightly over the covers, and I realized I'd memorized those small movements already. The way she tilts her head, the crease between her brows, the brief catch in her breath. And then, without warning, she looked up. Our eyes met, longer than necessary, and the space between us felt electric. I wanted to step closer, but the shop was crowded with shadows and tools and that quiet, almost sacred tension. She didn't look away this time, but neither did she speak. For a heartbeat, the world shrank. Just her and me, and the hum of the fluorescent lights above. And I knew, without saying a word, that something unspoken was threading itself between us, gentle, forbidden, and impossibly charged. The storm came out of nowhere. Rain pounded against the windows of the small hotel lobby where I'd been helping Sophie with some paperwork for her car rental, an unexpected errand she'd reluctantly let me handle. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above us, and the lobby smelled of damp carpet and faint coffee. Outside, the wind rattled the glass, and inside, it felt like the world had shrunk to just her and me. She was sitting across from me at the tiny table, hunched slightly over her notebook, pen poised in her hand. I tried not to stare, tried to ignore how her hair fell over her shoulder in a way that made her look both serious and tender at the same time. I could see the way her fingers flexed around the pen, the slight tremor from the storm, or maybe just from being near me. "I don't know why I didn't just call earlier," she murmured, almost to herself. I leaned forward slightly, sensing the hesitation in her voice. Something unspoken hung between us. Words she wanted to say, but stopped short. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at it quickly. A name flashed across the screen, someone from her past, someone I didn't know. She swiped it away without answering, her jaw tightening for a fraction of a second. I felt a pang of something, jealousy, fear, guilt, but I stayed still. I didn't reach for her hand. I didn't say anything. I just watched. The storm outside made the room feel smaller, more intimate. She shifted in her chair closer to me, just a little, but enough that the warmth of her coat brushed against my arm. My chest tightened, and I wanted to move, wanted to lean closer, wanted to ask if she felt it too. But I didn't. I couldn't. I forced myself to focus on the notebook, on the scribbled numbers, anything to avoid betraying what I felt. She looked up at me suddenly, eyes catching the overhead light, and for a heartbeat we just stared. Nothing was said. No one interrupted. No one intruded. Yet the silence between us was dense, charged, heavy. My heart raced, and I imagined what it would feel like to reach out, to close that tiny gap, to let the storm outside match the storm inside me. Her lips twitched in a small, almost apologetic smile. I wanted to ask what she was thinking, to tell her that I could feel it too, that whatever this was, it was real. But before I could, the elevator dinged, and another guest stepped into the lobby, breaking the spell. She straightened, smoothing her coat over her arms. I sank back into my chair, fighting the urge to linger, to prolong the moment that had barely begun. We returned to paperwork, exchanged neutral words, and yet my mind replayed the brief brush of proximity, the unspoken words that hovered like smoke between us. I walked her to the door when she finally left. The storm had slowed to a drizzle, but the air still smelled of wet asphalt. She didn't touch my arm, didn't lean closer, didn't give me a reason to act. And yet, the memory of our closeness stayed with me. The almost, the could have been, the electric pause. I stood there long after she disappeared into the night, hands stuffed in my pockets, feeling both tethered and untethered at once. That moment, so small, so fleeting, clung to me, and I couldn't stop thinking about how close we had been, how far we still were. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. The cafe was nearly empty, the low hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine the only soundtrack to the storm that had followed us here from the hotel lobby. Sophie sat across from me, hands wrapped around her cup, staring at the swirling coffee like it might answer the question she hadn't asked yet. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged themselves in my throat. Every glance I stole at her made me forget what I was about to say, made the air heavier, made the silence stretch. Finally, she exhaled, slow, deliberate, and let her voice slip through. "What are we doing?" I froze. The question wasn't new, not exactly, but hearing it spoken aloud, like a blade cutting through the pretense, made my stomach knot. I wanted to answer carefully, truthfully, but also vaguely, because saying the wrong thing could break everything before it had the chance to exist. I don't know, I admitted, voice low, almost swallowed by the cafe's quiet. She tilted her head, eyes catching mine, searching, weighing me. There was no judgment, no accusation, just the weight of awareness, of noticing something neither of us could name. I noticed everything about her in that moment. The faint line of tension in her jaw, the way her fingers drummed lightly on the rim of the cup, the small twitch at the corner of her mouth that betrayed the control she usually carried so easily. She didn't speak again. Instead, she studied me, and I felt her looking at me in a way that bypassed small talk, bypassed polite conversation, straight to the parts of me I tried not to show. And I realized I was doing the same. "I think," she began, her voice catching for a fraction of a second, "I think we're pretending this is normal. But it's not." I swallowed hard. She wasn't accusing me, not exactly. She was stating the obvious, yet saying it aloud made it sharper, more unbearable. I wanted to reach across the table, to bridge the distance, to close the space that wasn't supposed to exist, but I hesitated. My hands stayed hidden under the table. My pulse thundered in my ears. We sat like that, suspended between moments, the unspoken stretching longer than the rain outside. I noticed how tired she looked, how carefully she carried herself, how small her laugh had become over the last few meetings. And I realized I'd been watching, quietly, hoping she'd notice, hoping she wouldn't. Finally, she leaned back, eyes fixed on the window, tracing the rivulets of water. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke, but it cut deeper than anything else. "I don't know if I want to keep pretending I can handle this, or if I even can handle myself anymore." I wanted to tell her that I felt the same, that I couldn't stop thinking about her, that every time she brushed against me, or laughed, or even just breathed in my presence, I felt something I couldn't name. But the words failed me, so I just nodded. And for a long moment, we sat in silence, letting the weight of everything, fear, confusion, longing, restraint, settle like dust between us. And I couldn't stop thinking, maybe silence speaks louder than touch. Maybe it's the only truth we're allowed to share. I was stacking shelves at the bookstore when she walked in, late afternoon sunlight catching the gold in her hair. She carried that same careful composure, but there was something different today, something quieter, heavier. She wandered to the poetry section first, fingers brushing the spines like she was searching for something more than words. I followed slowly, pretending to rearrange the books, but my eyes never left her. She picked one out finally, a worn paperback with notes in the margins, and flipped it open as if she needed to see someone else's handwriting to remember herself. "I used to read this a lot," she murmured, more to herself than to me. Her voice had that fragile edge, the one that made me catch my breath without realizing it. Before, everything fell apart. I didn't move. I didn't know if I should say anything. There was a moment, a flicker, when I almost reached for her hand to bridge some invisible chasm, but I stayed rooted to the floor. My stomach twisted in that familiar mix of longing and hesitation. "What happened?" I asked softly, trying not to sound intrusive. She blinked, like she'd almost forgotten I was there. "Someone I loved a long time ago. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life with them." And then, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked away, tracing the edge of the book, her hands trembling just enough to betray her calm. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, that she could tell me everything. But the truth was, I didn't know how to navigate this tenderness. So I stayed quiet. Just watched. Just breathed. Then she laughed, soft, almost embarrassed, and shook her head. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't dump all of this on you." "No," I said quickly, more urgently than I intended. "It's okay. I trailed off, because I didn't know what just could possibly cover. Instead, I knelt to grab a misplaced volume from the floor, and that's when I noticed it, a photograph tucked into the book." She glanced over, eyes widening slightly. I picked it up carefully. Black and white, faded at the edges. Her younger self, laughing with a man whose face was partly turned away. I didn't recognize him, but I could see the depth of what she'd lost in the curve of her shoulders, in the easy intimacy she had with him. "I forgot this was here," she whispered, voice barely audible. Her hands hovered over mine as if she might take it, but then she didn't. She just stared, letting the memory exist between us. I handed it back gently. Our fingers brushed, just barely, and I felt the weight of her past settle lightly on me. And yet, strangely, it didn't push me away. It pulled me closer. She smiled then, small, fragile, but with something unspoken threading through it. Trust, maybe. Or acknowledgement. Or permission. I couldn't tell. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. And as she walked toward the counter to pay, I realized I couldn't stop looking at the space she'd occupied, at the tremor in her hands, at the quiet ache that made her human in ways I couldn't fully name. And when she left, stepping into the fading sunlight, I felt it, the shift. Something had changed between us, subtle, seismic, and irrevocable. A soft quake under our feet that neither of us could ignore. The evening was quiet, the street outside slick with rain that reflected the yellow-orange glow of the street lamps. We found ourselves on the same bench in the park where she sometimes came to read, her book resting unopened on her lap. I hadn't planned to come here, and I knew she hadn't either. But there we were, side by side, just existing in the same space, without forcing words into the silence. She looked at me briefly, and I caught the faintest hint of something softer than I'd ever seen before. Not love, not exactly, but recognition. A shared awareness of everything that had passed between us, the unspoken moments, the hesitations, the small almost that had brought us here. "I'm glad you're here," she said finally, voice low, almost a whisper. There was no rush in her tone, no pressure, just honesty quietly folding itself into the space between us. I nodded. "Me too." And then we just sat. No grand gestures. No confessions. Just the hum of distant traffic, the occasional drip of water from a nearby tree, and the comfort of presence. I noticed the way her hand shifted in her lap, and I moved mine slowly, deliberately, until our fingers brushed. Lightly, tentatively. Not needing more, but needing exactly that. She didn't pull away. She didn't close the gap, either. We let it exist, a silent agreement that this, whatever it was ours. The tension that had defined months of small encounters, near touches, and hesitant glances finally eased into a quiet understanding. Her head tilted slightly, and for a moment, our foreheads nearly touched. I could feel the faint warmth, the rise and fall of her breath, the subtle pulse of her presence against mine. I wanted to say something, anything that could name what we were both feeling, but I realized it wasn't necessary. Words would only clumsily map what had been quietly building, what had been lived in glances and pauses and silences. We sat like that for a long time. I noticed the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, the tiny exhale of tension in her shoulders, the way her lips curved into the faintest smile without even trying. I realized then that what had been slow, cautious, uncertain, and electric wasn't fragile, it was earned. Each near moment, each hesitation, each shadowed glance had layered itself into this quiet inevitability. I squeezed her fingers gently, not a declaration, not a demand, just a tether, a subtle acknowledgement of the closeness that had quietly crept between us. She returned the pressure, just enough to affirm that this was mutual, that the months of waiting, watching, and longing had led to something unspoken but undeniable. When she finally leaned back, resting her head against my shoulder just lightly, it felt like everything was in place. Not perfect, not a storybook, not loud or dramatic, just ours. And as the rain continued to fall, the city lights glimmered on the wet pavement, and the park remained empty around us. I understood that this quiet, earned closeness was final in its own way. The tension, the longing, the hesitations, they had all collapsed into something simple, something real. We didn't say anything more. We didn't need to. I think about that night often, even now. Not because it was perfect, or because everything fell neatly into place, because it didn't. It was messy, awkward, quiet, and real. It's funny how those are the nights that stick with you, the ones where nothing is shouted but everything is understood. I sit in my apartment now, the same notebook on my desk, and I replay the small details. The brush of her fingers against mine on the park bench, the faint tremor in her hands when she shared pieces of her past, the way her laugh softened around me once she realized I noticed more than she let on. I notice myself, too, how I've slowed down, how I listen longer, how I've learned that patience, quiet observation, and understanding are more powerful than any grand declaration. Sophie has changed in ways I could never have predicted. She's softer, yet more confident, more willing to let someone in, even if only in small, careful increments. She moves through the world with the same grace, but now there's a warmth in her presence that wasn't there before. Maybe she doesn't know she carries it. Maybe she thinks she's unchanged, but I see it. And love, I've realized, doesn't always roar. It lingers in the spaces between words, in the silence after a near confession, in the shared glance across a room. It's in the unremarkable days where someone chooses to stay, chooses to notice, chooses to brush your hand lightly without expecting anything in return. It's quiet, messy, imperfect, and yet inevitable when it's real. I think about all the near misses, the pauses, the moments we both held back because we weren't sure if we were allowed to feel this way. I think about the letters we never wrote, the glances we almost exchanged, the storms we waited out separately before finally sharing the space that made all the difference. And now, sitting here, I understand that none of those moments were wasted. Each hesitation, each small act of attention, each silence that stretched longer than comfort allowed, they led us to this place. Not perfect, not tidy, but ours. I don't know what the future holds, not really. But I know that we can navigate it together, or at least alongside each other, with patience, with understanding, with that quiet, slow-burning energy that started it all. And somehow, that feels like enough. If you've followed this story with me, felt the small sparks, the pauses, the near misses, and the quiet triumphs, then you know what I mean. Love doesn't have to shout to exist. Sometimes, it just waits until the timing and the people are ready. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?